Hey there, welcome to Musing Heavy, the site devoted to alternative reflections on hard rock and heavy metal. So here's a new series, and it's entitled Punk Attitudes in Heavy Music. Now, if you've followed anything I've done before, you'll know that most of the things I've talked about relate to heavy metal, especially, and then quite a bit of hard rock as well. And I'll throw in some prog rock there once in a while, too. But I haven't really talked about punk very much. I mean, I have a little bit in passing or hardcore music. Um, but I think it fits in really well with sort of the mandate of this channel, so to speak. In this particular series, while I am going to talk about some of the foundational bands of punk rock, I'm also going to relate this idea of punk attitudes to some heavy metal and hard rock acts. So I haven't really abandoned my foundation of hard rock and heavy metal. And just on a personal note, that yes, I still mostly listen to heavy metal and hard rock. I mean, I do listen to prog and some blues and stuff like that. But I've actually become a pretty big fan of punk rock and hardcore music, hardcore being one of the key outgrowths of punk. And to me, honestly, to my ears, when I listen to most hardcore bands and a lot of punk bands, there's a ton of crossover with metal and hard rock. Like to me, hardcore is pretty much metal with different haircuts and no guitar solos, or kind of a stripped down version of heavy metal in some ways. So I think this all fits together really well under the umbrella of heavy music. But no, this is really the first time that I guess I'm looking at punk sort of more head on, but I am going to relate it to other forms of heavy music, as we'll see throughout this series. So it's a 5-part YouTube series. The links are provided below that you can look at my other, I think I'm on my 11th or 12th series. So if you want to check out some of my other stuff on my YouTube channel, the links are below. Or if you'd rather just read the essay, that link is provided below as well. All right, so let's get rolling here. And as usual, I'll share the old screen and you can follow along. So just to put this in sort of just a wider sort of format, the spirit of punk. So where did I kind of come to this whole idea of punk attitudes and applying it to heavy music, etc.? Well, it sort of starts with this idea. I got to thinking that the curious thing about highly inventive or innovative forms of music is that initial fringe audience enthusiasm typically wanes if eventual wider acceptance occurs, right? So in other words, I'm not saying everybody in the fringe thinks this way, but if you're the type of person that listens to obscure music, right, you might also be the type of person that your enthusiasm sort of declines if that music becomes more embraced by the mainstream, right? And so why does this happen for some people? In part, it may be the too cool for the masses attitude of some connoisseurs who automatically reject anything that hints of popularity, regardless of its artistic merit. Now, whether these folks realize it or not, they are just as beholden to prevailing styles as those who embrace popular fads wholeheartedly. Okay? They might not think themselves trendy, but they're ruled by fashions just the same. All right. So I'm not saying everybody's like that. In fact, I'd like to think that most serious music fans that normally travel along the peripheries are not that superficial, right? Hopefully, the primary reason that one might shun an artist that becomes too popular has to do with the art itself, particularly if it was compromised to achieve greater commercial rewards. And that would be fair enough, right? But conversely, artists that do roughly the same thing over and over and over again in efforts to keep their fringe fan base pacified could be accused of playing it safe, right? Or even selling out, right? Now, in this case, they're not selling out to the mainstream or to make more money, but they're selling out to their narrowly defined audience, okay? Okay, so that's really the motivation for this discussion, or sort of the backdrop of all of this. The motivation centers on this inevitable push and pull of internal artistic vision and outside influence that I guess most artists always sort of wrestle with, right? One way to assess this is to borrow terminology commonly associated with punk rock and evaluate an artist's degree of punkness, if you will, right? Now, there's lots of definitions of punk out there, and lots of people have their own views on what punk rock is, for example. But I favor any doctrine that adheres to the be yourself attitude, right? In which a true punk approach centers on fresh creative activity and, importantly, not following fashions in any way, right? Now, this is very much in line with the Johnny Lydon, also known as Johnny Rotten gospel. Now, I'm not saying Johnny was the only one to say this stuff. In fact, lots of people have said this, but I think Johnny said it early, and I think he said it the best, and he said it the most consistently too, right? So another way of looking at this, if you're attempting to develop something novel and it's a true extension of yourself, right? You are being punk, right? However, if you're trying to look or sound punk in a stereotypical way and largely just imitating what came before, well, then Johnny would say you're missing the point, right? That's not what punk is at all, right? So for me, there's a big difference between being punk in attitude and being punk in style, right? And that really forms the basis of what this series is about. And I'm going to apply this sort of idea throughout the series, right? Let me just elaborate a little more. For instance, any artist striving to create something original is punk in attitude. And it doesn't matter if they look punk or not, right? Even if their art has nothing to do with the common trappings of punk rock, i.e., which is often referred to as simple bar chord blasts, anti-establishment lyrics, and spiky hair. Okay, so you can be punk in attitude and really have none of those characteristics, is what I'm going to argue. But on the other side of the coin, there's lots of bands labeled as punk rock because of their playing method or their choice of clothing, and they're really just merely punk in style, or at least cease to be authentically punk in attitude over the long term. Okay, so the remainder of this discussion, the essay and the series that I'm gonna get into here, explores this apparent paradox. So just a little roadmap here. In the first sections of this essay, I consider 3 historic punk bands. So we're going to look at 3 historic punk bands in some detail: the Sex Pistols, the Ramones, and the Clash. So I'm going to talk about the Sex Pistols here in just a second. And then in part 2 of this YouTube presentation, I'm going to look at the Ramones and the Clash. And I'm going to dissect just how punk in attitude these groups really were. And I'm going to say some things that might surprise, especially some hardcore punks out there may or may not agree with what I'm saying. So that'll be kind of cool, I think. And then from there, I illustrate how other musicians who most would never associate with punk are in fact very punk in attitude. And I'm going to look specifically at Ted Nugent. That'll be part 3 in the YouTube presentation. And Jimi Hendrix and Eddie Van Halen, which will be part 4, I'm specifically going to assess them. So almost nobody would associate Nugent, Hendrix, and Van Halen with punk, but I'm going to argue these guys are punk in attitude to the core, right? So I'll explain why I think that in that part of the series. And then in the latter parts of the paper, I argue that not only did several hardcore bands carry on with the punk in attitude spirit, as you might expect, the same can be said for the early innovators of extreme metal. Right, so the earliest bands of, say, black metal and thrash metal and death metal were, again, really punk in attitude. And somewhat ironically, I'd say we're more punk in a lot of ways than a lot of the so-called contemporary punk bands, which are actually just punk in style at best. They're just following a fashion, right? So again, I'm going to sort of talk about that as well. All right, okay, so let's look specifically at how punk were the Pistols, Clash, and Ramones, because this is going to give us some nice foundation for this whole punk in attitude versus punk in style arguments I'm trying to make. And specifically in this, we're going to look at right now the Sex Pistols. And I've sort of titled this somewhat provocatively, but I believe it to be completely true. Johnny Rotten and Sid Vicious couldn't be more different. All right. A lot of people sort of put those two guys together. Yeah, they were important figureheads for the 1970s punk movement. In fact, in some ways, maybe the most recognizable characters of that scene, right? But for me, Johnny Rotten was miles away from Sid Vicious, and I'll get into why in a second. But there are just a couple pictures of the Pistols back in the 70s. So here they are. Here's Sid Vicious on the left. Steve Jones, the guitar. So Sid Vicious played bass amongst other antics, I guess you could say. Steve Jones was the guitar player, very much the musical brains of the band in a lot of ways. As was Glenn Madlock, original bassist too. I'll talk about that a little more in a second. Here's Johnny Rotten, Johnny Lydon. Again, the vocalist, the lyricist, and in a lot of ways, the king of punk at that time. And Paul Cook, the drummer. Okay, a fantastic drummer in his own right. And here they are looking punk, I guess you could say, the spiky hair with Johnny and Sid, lots of leather, lots of different looking clothing, I guess you could say. Here's some action shots of them. Here's Glenn Madlock, the original bass player, but again, note the torn clothing and which was kind of a trademark of punk back in those days. Or here's Sid looking all ripped up and sliced up, kind of doing his Iggy Pop, I guess. Again, meant to provoke, right? Etc. So, all right, so let's dig in here. So the Sex Pistols released only one album of significance. But wow, what an album, right? Nevermind the Bollocks came out in 1977 and is about as prototypical a punkin' style and punkin' attitude artifact as we have. I mean, there's a lot of really important early punk albums, but I don't think anything has the magnitude of Nevermind the Bollocks. It was authentic, it was novel, it was revolutionary in scope. Okay, some people argue that there's a little bit on Bollocks that did borrow from the Ramones, right? I don't really buy that. But even if you subscribe to that, I don't think anybody is going to deny the groundbreakingness, if I can put it that way, of Bollocks. Its genre defining quality certainly qualifies Bollocks as a prime example of punk in attitude. It was original, it was groundbreaking, it was incredibly creative. But musically, this is pretty much the exact opposite of complicated prog rock and extended jams that were pervasive in rock at the time. And that's some ways, that's why it was so revolutionary. There was nothing really like it at the time. Indeed, one gets the impression that any amateur garage band could easily absorb the Pistols' rudimentary sound structures and rattle off those basic riffs or keep Paul Cook's simple 4/4 beat. It was simple, but that was its genius in a lot of ways. Now, Johnny Rotten doesn't really sing in any conventional sense. This isn't Freddie Mercury, okay? And appears to wear a lack of training badge on his sleeve while barking out snide commentary on bothersome things. And yeah, a lot of things bothered Johnny and still do. Amongst the roar of Steve Jones's guitar, there's actually lots of catchy melody in the Pistols' music, which arguably is the only blatant sign of exceptional talent, at least in a conventional sense. I think the Pistols were oozing talent. It just wasn't conventional, right? Bassist Glenn Madlock was fired before fully recording Bollocks, allegedly for quarreling over Rotten's provocative lyrical content. He didn't like the lyrics to God Save the Queen. He didn't like the lyrics to Anarchy in the UK and others, right? And/or was a victim of Malcolm McLaren's managerial manipulations, which probably is closer to the truth given all the stuff I've read on the Pistols. This proved to be a major loss, as Madlock was at least equal to Steve Jones in providing musical structure for the songs, okay? Nevertheless, the band carried on, and they appointed Sid Vicious to assume bass duties in time for the release of Bollocks and subsequent tours. Tellingly, though, and this is important, I think, Sid Vicious's playing was never important at all, right? Jones handled the bass on the majority of the Pistols' recorded material. In fact, songs that even had any bass at all, for that matter. with the exception of a few cuts in which Madlock's contributions were just retained. Even in concert, Sid's bass was frequently turned very low in an attempt to cover up his ineptness. He was not a player at any level. Now, some might say that's the beauty of it. That's what could be more punk than a guy who really can't play, right? But the reality is, Sid was punk in style, right? And that's what I'm going to get into here. The Sid Vicious character, or caricature, perhaps, is maybe a better way to put it, was a classic example of punk in style above all else. He was little more than a follower and a major scenester prior to joining the Pistols, but in fairness, he did increase the Pistols' notoriety and frequency of press clippings, absolutely. He was a striking figure in terms of punk fashion, right? He had it down, the spiky hair, the perpetual sneer, torn clothing, tight jeans, safety pins, all that sort of thing, and had a notorious reputation for general hooliganism, smashing his bass over fans, heads and all kinds. He was kind of a riot waiting to happen kind of wherever he went. This hooliganism was undoubtedly a key requisite for punk and style at the time, too, by the way. Indeed, Vicious, along with Rotten, became figureheads for punk rock's over-sensationalized anti-establishment image at a level far more threatening than any of their UK contemporaries. Be it the Damned, the Clash, Susie and the Banshees, the Vibrators, the Buzzcocks, etc. The Pistols were deemed an incredibly dangerous band, and actually a lot of their concerts on tours never happened. They just were canceled. Now, the fact that Sid was devoid of any original musical ideas really didn't seem to bother most people. His celebrity grew exponentially via nonstop tabloid coverage regarding drug addictions and criminal activities, accumulating in his alleged murder of girlfriend Nancy Spungen and Sid's unfortunate death by heroin overdose at only 21 sealed the Sid Vicious legacy forevermore, right? So that was Sid, figurehead for sure, but punk in style, and that's it. No real musical substance going on here at all. In fact, Sid was a follower, right? And his best friend Johnny says that over and over again in any of the books or things that he's talked about. Now, let's talk about Johnny a little more here. Johnny Rotten, Johnny Lydon, on the other hand, was the real deal in terms of punk in attitude. And this carried on well beyond his brief stint as a Pistol. Remember, the Pistols only happened for a couple of years. As important as they were, right, it was really a short period of time. Although outtakes, demos, and live documents of Rotten are included on the Half-Baked, The Great Rock and Roll Swindle, the second album, which to me is not even really worth worrying about, Johnny was out of the Pistols upon its release and remained so until reuniting in 1996 for a couple of tours and a live album. That live album of 96 actually is really good, in my view. Far from playing it safe and giving the blossoming scene more prototypical punk rock. So what did Johnny do when he left the Pistols? Right, he sure didn't play it safe. Lydon embarked on a full-scale reinvention with his subsequent band, Public Image Limited, or PIL. Much of the punk and style fan base would have been thoroughly confused by, and actually some were quite hostile towards, PIL's first issue, 1978 album, with its sprawling avant-garde songs, complicated structures, ample guitar meanderings, spoken word passages, and at times even dance dub rhythms. This was nothing like Nevermind the Bollocks, not even close. Indeed, punk's most recognizable artists on the surface seemed to be avoiding punk altogether. Or was he? I would argue, no, not at all. In truth, Lydon's punk and attitude ethic was never stronger during those early PIL releases, which along with first issue included the groundbreaking second edition Metal Box album of 1979, one of the best albums by anybody, and the nearly as innovative The Flowers of Romance of 1981. Later PIL offerings were arguably a little less forward-thinking, but still had the ability to challenge and confound audiences. For example, Who would have guessed that guitar wizard Steve Vai and old guard drummer Ginger Baker of Cream and etc. would ever play with the so-called king of punks, let alone make it work famously, as was the case with PIL's album of 1986. It's an album called Album. If you bought the cassette, it was called Cassette, right? Anyway, but yeah, Steve Vai and Ginger Baker are on that album. Who would have guessed that, right? But that's what happened, and it actually is a great album. At least to my ears, there's nothing that sounds quite like the ever-evolving PIL or PIL, which I attribute to the fact that Lydon never lost his punk in attitude ethic, right? See recent examples. See What the World Needs Now of 2018, or an album called End of the World, which was just released actually just a few months ago, for recent examples of what Johnny's been up to. Even if his punk and style projections are long gone, he's never lost that punk in attitude style, or approach, I should say. Or allow me to take this one step further. One could make the argument that Lydon was never truly punk in style, right? He, along with the original Pistols, i.e. not Sid, right? Because Sid wasn't an original Pistol, created a sound and a look all their own that later became popularized into a trend, right? They didn't follow the trend, they created it, right? So that probably makes them not really punk in style. Punk in attitude for miles, but not really punk in style. It was other bands and fans that did the aping by adopting merely the punk in style component of the movement, and in so doing, missed the true essence of being punk, right? So for my money, the Sex Pistols, minus Sid Vicious, that is, were completely punk in attitude. And Johnny Lydon in particular is maybe the prototypical punk in attitude guy who was also a figurehead, but he was punk to the core. Sid just never got it. Neither did manager Malcolm McLaren, who was always about the trends and just creating chaos for the sake of chaos, right? Johnny Lydon said that over and over again, that their manager didn't get it either, right? But Johnny certainly did. Anyway, in part 2, I'm going to talk about a couple other groundbreaking punk bands, traditional punk bands, the Ramones and the Clash, and I'm going to talk about how punk in attitude these bands were, and some of what I'm going to say might surprise some of the longtime punkers out there. Hope you'll join me for that. All right. Take care. And hopefully you'll check out the series if you have the time. Thanks a lot.